Welcome to Spread Love in Organizations, a podcast for purpose-driven healthcare leaders striving to make life better around the world by leading their teams with genuine care, servant leadership, and love. I'm Naji, your host for this exciting episode from our new series focused on us as leaders. I'm joined by Dr. Elsbeth Johnson, senior lecturer at MIT Sloan School of Management and an expert on leadership, strategy, and change. The main focus of her research is on what leaders need to do to help their organizations execute strategy or deliver long-term strategic change without the need for the leader's ongoing personal involvement. Who of us don't need this? Prior to joining MIT, Elsbeth taught leadership at London Business School and London School of Economics. Prior to academia, Dr. Johnson worked as an investment banker, a sell-side equity analyst, and a corporate strategist. She also spent 3 years as a special advisor for the First Blair government in the UK. As a consultant and an executive educator, Elsbeth has worked with a range of companies, helping them develop their strategy and the capabilities and culture that will deliver it. I had the opportunity to be her student this year in the MIT MBA program and couldn't but ask her if she can share her wisdom and advice with all of you. I am thrilled to have you with me today.
Thrilled to be here, Naji. Thank you.
I want to start first to hearing more about your personal story, from investment banking to politics to now being a professor of leadership at MIT. What's in between the lines of your journey?
Yeah, it's a bit varied, isn't it? So I mean, investment banking was very much where I started, and actually I loved the city. So the city is kind of it's the UK equivalent of Wall Street. Lots of smart people, all of whom worked really hard. I really felt at home in that environment. But I'd always been very interested in politics. So as a teenager, as a student, I'd been interested and involved in politics. And so it was a bug that I had to kind of give into until I felt like I didn't want to be a professional politician myself. And so I worked on the Labour campaign in '97, which resulted in, the largest Labour landslide since 1945. Not that that was personally down to me, and then I joined the Labour government. So I left the city, joined the government as a special advisor, worked in 3 different departments of state, worked on another 2 election campaigns. So it was very, very enjoyable. But what I guess I realized was there was quite a few things I missed from the private sector. And there was quite a few things that I didn't necessarily like about doing politics professionally, kind of for a living. But I guess if I looked at the red thread that links banking and particularly the kind of work that I did in banking, so corporate strategy, corporate finance, structured finance, thinking about businesses and why they make money. I mean, that's basically, a sell-side equity analyst is essentially a well-paid financial journalist in many ways. And the sort of work I did in politics and the sort of work I've done since then, I mean, basically it's thinking about 2 things. It's thinking about strategy, what's not just the best way to do this, but what's the right thing to do. And secondly, then once you've settled on what you're going to do, is what are the activities that leaders need to focus on in order to get that work done in the most effective way. And so essentially, I mean, that I suppose, to the extent that there is a red thread, that would be it.
Awesome. You touched it on, this thread with your life, with the decisions that you've made. And I know in the very first course that we had with you and the discussions, we talked about, the green circle, blue circle. If you can touch it maybe before saying, but what I would love to hear from you is your personal green circle, if I may. What is your personal purpose? I know you make us work a lot around this, so I'd love to hear yours.
So that's a really good question. And it's not the first time I've been asked this question. And every time I'm asked it, I think, wow, I'm not sure my answer is very good. I'm not sure my answer is probably as good as yours now is given I asked you this question in class. So I think when I think about the purpose of why I continue to do what I do with, particularly with clients, because I could just either teach all the time or retire or whatever. I think what I really like doing is finding, and I think about, the businesses with whom I work these days and the leaders with whom I work. I guess what I really like doing is finding and helping people find the work that they most love to do. Because an awful lot of people, I don't think spend enough time really focusing on the work that they really love to do. That a lot of people are very good at lots of things, right? So they're in a spoiled position of having lots of options open to them. But if they were to focus on the work they really love doing, I think that's particularly interesting. And I have to say, I think the most effective leaders out there are the ones who really want to lead, rather than simply be senior in an organization. Leading and being senior are two very different things. The reason you do those things are very different, right? So if all of our leaders are just the people who are obsessed with gaining and retaining positional power, then I suspect we'll end up with leaders who aren't quite as good as the ones we could end up with if we really focus on getting people who really wanted to lead. And so one of the things I really enjoy about my work outside of teaching, outside of MIT, is I get to spend time with people both who are already leaders, but also people who are maybe one or two below C-suite, who are thinking about, do I want to be at the C level? Do I want to be a leader? And really kind of helping, finding the ones who really want to lead as opposed to simply be senior, and then helping them get there is just incredibly rewarding.
I love where the discussion is going. I always say life is too short, right? Like you thought, like, are you doing the thing that you really love? Totally. Life's too short. And I know sometimes it's hard, it's easier to say than do, but it's just incredible when your personal why is in total coherence with what you're doing every single morning, right? Like this is where I think magic starts.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm not sure that I'm always as disciplined. Like I really need to read my own slides a bit more than I do, right? I'm not sure I'm always as disciplined as I could be about the why. I mean, I really have no excuse to not focus on, the stuff that I really enjoy and the stuff that I think adds most value, because I'm in a privileged position of not needing to work. And so I have no excuse not to be doing the absolute, most value adding work or most enjoyable work. And yet, there's still days when I just think, oh, why did I agree to this? We're all, we all sometimes aren't quite as focused as we ought to be.
Oh yeah.
But it's the 80-20 rule, as long as you're kind of doing it most of the time.
Exactly. As long as work is not more than 20% not liking it, right? We all have in our jobs things we do we don't enjoy, but it shouldn't be more than 20%. I do the same rule. When you were talking about leaders, right? Senior execs, C-suite leaders, younger managers, leaders that you help. What is for you the most important trait for leaders of the 21st century? If there's one thing, I know we discussed a lot of different topics in class, and you taught us a lot about this, but for you, what is the most important one to have?
So for me, and you're right, there's lots of traits that we know from empirical research are really important. But for me, and this probably says something about my own value set and upbringing, I am always looking for a combination of two things. One is high capability. And I guess what I mean by that is really high capability, really clever, very applied, high capability, with low ego. Now, I have one or two clients who, in my mind, personify exactly that combination of high capability and low ego. And they are just a treat to work with. But I think if we can get more leaders who are in that combination, I just think regardless of the culture of the organization, that's always a great combination. Because what that enables, what that combination enables is obviously high capability, right? People are smart, they're able to get stuff done, they've got a lot of processing power. But low ego means that they put the work, they put the business, they put their clients, they put each other, they put the people, the next generation of leaders before themselves or before their own need for validation or promotion. And I do think that's important. I think, you know, history is replete with examples of when, if an individual or a collection of individuals put the greater good, the quality of the cause ahead of their own need to benefit, then actually chances are higher that good things will happen. I mean, as someone once said, and forgive me, I can't remember who this was, but it's amazing what good things you can do if you no longer care about who gets the credit. And that's kind of what I mean by low ego, that they put the work and they put other people ahead of their own need for validation or credit.
And do you think, if I want to double click on this, do you think those are skills that can be developed, that can be coached?
Great question. So, I mean, what psychology would tell us is that, you know, I mean, that both capability and low ego are a combination of nurture, how we're brought up, and a little bit of nature, particularly capability. Some of these intellectual or cognitive skills are to some extent inherited, but our environment, particularly our young early age environment, is very, very important. I think the low ego stuff is largely around how we're brought up, what we come to value, and also what our organizations value. So, you know, I grew up on an island where most people knew each other. A lot of people were related to each other. It didn't matter if you were really, really clever. This island did not suffer tall poppies, right? So you know, like you had to get on with everybody because, you know, if the blizzard came and you needed somebody's help, you better have not been a jerk to them at any point in the previous 3 years, because people on an island have long memories, right? So I think, to your point about, is it, you know, how do you get this combination of high capability, low ego? I think some of it is nature, some of it's nurture, but I also think it's what we're brought up to value. And so, you know, I'm pretty allergic to high egos because I grew up in a world, literally an island, where high egos just weren't tolerated, you know. So I think our own sensitivities to these things are largely a product of our value set, however that's been acquired.
You talked also, you know, we talked here about the traits of leaders. You talked about, in your book, I have to relate to it, and honestly, the leading strategic change and the framework that you give in Step Up and Step Back, that book is really amazing. And you touch on something that is called meaningful autonomy. So I'd love to hear about it. But before that, why I'm talking about the book, because you summarized it in one sentence at the end of the class, and you talked about it just in the introduction here. You said something I will always remember. You said the most essential job of a leader is to create more leaders. So that is so powerful. And I think it links into this low ego and how you care about your people, how you bring, you said in the beginning, the next generation of leaders. So expand, please, a little bit more about this.
Well, let me expand a little bit more on that, and then I'll talk about meaningful autonomy. But I do think, I mean, this was Mary Follett who originally came up with this idea that, or this statement that, you know, the primary job of leaders is to create the next generation of leaders. Now, you obviously at one point, or in one way as a leader, you use your positional power to create the next generation of leaders just by promoting people. choosing a pipeline of successors and deciding who's going to get the top job. I think the problem, though, is that either creates a vicious or a virtuous circle. If the existing set of leaders are all high ego, value certain things, what we know about human psychology, it's called the affinity bias, is that people will choose, they will essentially self-replicate. They will choose successors who look and smell like them. And so the real risk or danger is that if you've got an existing set of perhaps quite high ego leaders, chances are that for a set of reasons, including that people self-replicate, but also that the candidates for leadership will look up above them, and the low ego ones will go, oh, well, there's no point in me trying to be a leader around here, because when I look up above me, the only people who are in positions of power are high egos. So either I need to change and stop being low ego, or I need to go in somewhere else and try and be a leader where my low ego tendencies are not going to be punished. So the self-replication that we very often see in organizations around leadership and who gets promoted typically means that it's quite hard to break the vicious circle of high ego leadership. But assuming that you can, then yeah, your job as a leader is to create this next generation who understand what good leadership looks like, who've been taught and coached about how to do it well, because then it becomes, you just cascade that down. So,
and do you, before jumping into the autonomy piece, because it's a very important one, you talk about affinity bias, self-replication, and I want to expand it even more. It's something I constantly have in my mind, right? At some point, I remember very early in my career, someone told me, usually we recruit our clones, right? Which I hate, when I think about it.
It's frightening, isn't it?
Yeah, especially when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, right?
Oh, yeah. So it's unfair.
Yeah, so the circle that we need to break on high ego, it's the same that we need to break on men, women, diversity, ethnicities.
Yeah.
How do you, I consciously and intentionally look into those unconscious biases in every recruitment I make with the teams? Anything specific you've seen and been successful on breaking this vicious circle, as we call?
Well, I think two things. I think, first of all, getting as many people involved in the recruitment and promotion process as possible. If you like, that's not to reduce any individual affinity bias that any individual leader brings to the table, but all it does is create a portfolio of hopefully different affinity biases, assuming that, not all of your leaders are white, straight, able-bodied men. In other words, assuming that there is some both cognitive and social diversity amongst your leadership population. If there isn't, then you need to be looking outside for some help on that from, recruitment consultants or headhunters to really force you to look at candidates whom left to your own devices you wouldn't think of as plausible candidates. So that's the first thing, is to broaden the portfolio of affinity biases. As I say, as individuals, we all have these biases because we're human. Almost the best we can hope for is that we, if you and I are both recruiting somebody, you've got a different set of affinity biases from me, and therefore, yours will challenge mine and vice versa. So that's the first thing. The second thing to say is that the process of recruitment has to be very carefully structured and managed. So, it frightens me, but it's true that there are still some organizations in the world who don't even use structured interviews, that they just kind of bring someone in for a chat, or they meet over coffee, or they recruit out of their network. And what we know about all of those sources of candidates is, because our networks will self-replicate, there'll be, and when we just chat with someone, we are essentially trying to discern social fit. In other words, oh, look, we went to the same school, or we both play golf at the same club, or we both, do the same running track. So it's human beings are incredibly almost invisibly skilled at sniffing out social fit. And so if you just quote unquote have a chat with someone, actually you'll be doing a terrible job recruiting them or interviewing them. You'll be doing a great job working out whether you could be friends with them. But so at the very least, what people need to do is have structured interviews. In other words, if I've got 6 candidates, I basically ask them the same question, hopefully in a sufficiently conversational way so I don't sound like a robot, but I am asking them the same set of questions so that I can form my assessment of them across. But even more than that, we should be going beyond interview, because most semi-articulate human beings are actually very good at impression managing. And so, if you ask me to give you an example of where I've been really collaborative in the past, guess what? I'm a semi-articulate human being, and I'll probably come up with a couple of really plausible sounding examples of me being super collaborative. And you'll be thinking, oh, wow, she's amazingly collaborative. Actually, I might not be. I might just be impression managing. So a much better way to test that is not in an interview scenario or setting at all, but actually in an experiential setting where you put me, in a group of other people, perhaps under some stressful conditions, and you watch and see whether I can collaborate rather than ask and listen to me tell you, and quite possibly fabricate some of my collaborative tendencies. So I think there's lots of ways we can get smarter about how we recruit. Now, the problem with all of the things that I've just talked about is they take longer and they are more expensive ways of recruiting. And so for those of us who perhaps, or organizations that don't have that much time or enough budget, it can feel easy and pain-free to compromise on our recruitment process, whereas actually compromising on our recruitment process is one of the most expensive mistakes an organization can make.
Definitely. Thank you for that. Going back, I want to go to these 2 words about meaningful autonomy that you talk about, because I think some people would be afraid of the word autonomy, some others would be excited about it, but I love how you framed it, which is meaningful autonomy and not only autonomy. So what are your thoughts about this? And for us as leaders, how to get to this really good position where our people can be meaningfully autonomous?
Yeah. So the reason that I call it meaningful autonomy is because in my research, so my research is inductive research, which means I go and watch and ask people, very open-ended questions, a lot of it done by watching and observing, so ethnographic research. What is it that makes your autonomy meaningful? Or sorry, what is it that what is it that means that you don't have to go and ask your leader for input or support or cover? And a number of my informants said, oh, well, in other words, what you're really asking me is what makes my autonomy meaningful. And that's the critical point, that these words actually came not out of my mouth or my head, but out of the mouths of my informants. And so that became a really interesting research question. And it turns out there's 2 things that really help someone come to work and exercise the autonomy, the decision rights that they have technically been given, but that where they feel that they can actually exercise these rights without having to escalate and go back to their leader and say, help me, or referee between these 2 options, or tell me what I should do. So the 2 things are when the exercise of the autonomy is possible. In other words, they've got enough resources, they've got enough time, the scope isn't stupid or too great. So in other words, lots of structural elements, all of the structural elements are in place to enable them to exercise their autonomy. But then beyond the structural element, there's almost the psychological element, which is that it is not only possible, but also pleasant, that they're comfortable in exercising their autonomy. They don't feel like they are having to go out on a limb or take on unnecessary risk. And the elements that really help there are when the leader has really signaled in every possible way that they can what they want, and back that up. So not only been clear about what they want, but also aligned the organization and been consistent in that over a period of time. That means that people don't have to second guess, well, you say that you want this, but that's not what I see you role model, and it's not what you measure. And by the way, that's not how it's not what my OKRs contain. So all of a sudden, if you're sending me incongruent signals, I'm having to second guess what you really want me to do. And the critical thing there is that good employees who want to come to work and do their best, they do not want incongruent, inconsistent leaders, because that does not help them. The corollary is also true, that your less good employees who kind of want to come to work and have a slightly easier time or not do amazing work, they absolutely love it when leaders are inconsistent or incongruent, because it gives them a get out of jail card. They can come to you at their performance appraisal and say, so sure, I know you said you wanted me to do this. You even wrote it in my job description, but I don't see you role model it, and it's not how you're going to reward me, and it's not even what we measure. So you can't possibly hold me accountable for the thing that you asked me to do. So that's really what we mean by meaningful autonomy. And I guess the most interesting thing about, or almost counterintuitive thing about this idea, is that autonomy needs to be constrained, albeit in certain ways, in order to become meaningful. Now, this can feel a little bit paradoxical first time I say that, right? What do you mean constrained autonomy? It's almost an oxymoron. Actually, it isn't. Unconstrained autonomy is actually frightening for your best employees, because they actually really do need to know and have you signal consistently what you want. Unconstrained autonomy is nirvana for your worst employees, because they're rubbing their hands with glee at that point. They get to do exactly what they want. They get to spend shareholder money doing whatever they fancy, their hobbies. So unconstrained autonomy is fabulous for them. But this idea of constrained autonomy, it's the constraints, the clarity and level of prescription that leaders give in the constraint that sets up, that frees up the people who report to them to really shine in delivering what the leaders have asked for. And so the quality of the autonomy experienced by managers is directly proportionate to the quality of prescription and the clarity of that prescription given to managers by leaders.
That's amazing. And I'm not going to detail really, things in the book. There are gems there. You talk about
because we want people to buy it.
Yeah, clarity, alignment, focus, consistency. We're going to talk about these also a little bit more, but really the framework is super helpful. I'm going to jump into a section that is a little bit different. So I'm going to give you one word, and I'd love to have your first reaction to it. So the first one is authentic leadership.
So I guess my one word response would be misunderstood. An awful lot of people, I think, certainly a lot of the leaders that I work with, they hear the words authentic leadership, and they misunderstand it in one of two ways. They either think, okay, in order to be authentic, I just show up as myself. I just kind of vomit myself into the room like a human hand grenade. And, whatever I'm kind of, however I show up, that's just my authentic self. So what else could I do? In other words, it's relatively uncontrolled. And that's a huge mistake, obviously, because as leaders, we have an obligation to manage ourselves for the benefit of, our people, our organization. So that's the first way in which I think a lot of leaders misunderstand authentic leadership and the requirements that it puts on them. I think the second way that leaders very often misunderstand authentic leadership is that they, certainly in my experience, they don't always realize that who you are changes over time. Now, I think that sounds really obvious when I say it, but we again, part of the human condition, another cognitive misconception, is that we very often underestimate the extent of the changes that we'll undergo as human beings over the long term. We typically overestimate how much we can get done in the short term, but we underestimate how much we can do and how much we can change over the long term. I'm talking decades rather than months or years. And so I think as a result of that, we very often think, well, you know, in 20 years' time, I'll basically just be the same person. Whereas actually, chances are that's not true. But more than that, if you think you're not really going to change that much, or that you don't think you could change that much, you might be missing some opportunities that you could be looking for in your career. And I think that's a real shame. So I think that would be my reaction. It's very often a misunderstood concept.
Yeah, and you talked, I remember you talked also about the different selves, right? Like in different places, situations. So it's really related also on how we change over time.
Right.
The second word would be focus.
Well, I mean, focus for me is the thing, it's the secret. I won't say secret sauce because that makes it sound like it's kind of some secret recipe. Focus is, for me, the thing that explains whether some strategies get implemented and some leaders make it versus other strategies that actually probably intellectually were equally good strategies, but they didn't get implemented. Focus is the thing that means that it requires choice, it requires deliberate choice to do certain things or spend time on certain things or invest in certain things and not others. And I think, I suspect we are much worse at this as human beings than we have ever been, because I think a lot of people, they're so used to not doing without in their lives, at least, you know, in the first world, right? You go on Amazon, you can have whatever you want. You know, things are, you know, available. I mean, they're not currently available in my country because we've managed to cut our own supply chain because we've just, you know, left a 40-year trading arrangement unilaterally. But assuming you don't live in an irrational country that, you know, commits economic suicide, you know, things are available. And I don't think people have to choose that often. But actually, that's a complete misconception, because the most important things in life, like time, for example, is completely finite. So back to your point earlier, you know, life's too short. I mean, that's a classic example of framing a series of choices. We only have so many hours in the day and so many days in our lives. So we have to choose how to spend them well. And focus is really the thing that focus is what results from the choices that you make. So the fact that an awful lot of people and organizations lack focus, I think, is basically because people just don't want to choose.
I love this framing, deliberate choices, you know, and many times we see here discussing with leaders and in organizations, right, the list of priorities that keep on, you know, moving and changing. So I'm more and more just talking about, like, what are the choices? What are the 2-3 things that we want to do and be great at, right? And it's tough to choose. So, but this is what we need to do for able to be.
And I would add to that I think the other problem is that, you know, an awful lot of organizations will run a strategic planning process almost like an event, you know, once a year or once every 2 years. And out of that may actually come some pretty clear choices. But the problem is that over time, the clarity gets corrupted because they add in, you know, so-called additional priorities. And so one of the things that I wouldn't say force, because I mean, you know, I can't quite force my clients to do things, but one of the things I very strongly advise my clients to do is that for every additional priority that they say they want, they have to take something off the list. So the total amount of work doesn't increase, and therefore the total amount of bandwidth that is being sucked up isn't eroded, and therefore employees continue to have the slack that they need to stand back and think and reflect and learn about the work rather than just do the work. It's what I call in the book the Tea Party test. This idea that, you know, the total amount of well, in the Tea Party's case, legislation doesn't sort of passively accumulate over time. It's exactly the same with work in organizations. If by all means, choose an alternative or another priority, but you can't do that at the expense of the overall amount of work that's on. So if something's going to be added to the list, something else that was already on the list needs to be taken off it. And it's actually, by the way, amazing when you say to people, okay, if you want that additional thing, that means you can't have one of the things that you said was really important. It's amazing how that focuses minds. And an awful lot of people go, oh, okay, well, in that case, I don't really need that other thing.
Exactly. And did you find a good kind of cycle to force leadership to go through the exercise and say, if you add something, you take out something else? Or because one of the things I'm always amazed by how organically things boil up, and after like 3 months of clarity, if you don't keep on having the same discipline, right, and coming back and making sure that it's really focused on 2-3 things, organically things grow, right? Like it's always the case.
It's such a good point. And that organic growth is essentially the thing that you're trying to, a bit like a gardener is always trying to kind of keep the wildness at bay, right? So one of the things that we always encourage is, leaders to kind of take a cold, hard look at themselves in terms of, are they helping create and protect slack for their managers? But we also encourage managers to give leaders feedback on exactly that point. So when we have a set of diagnostics that we run in these organizations to test things like how much bandwidth has been taken up, to what extent is your leader giving you additional priorities that suck up the time that you previously had as slack, and if we get a signal that that's becoming a problem, then that's the kind of red flashing warning light that says to leaders that they probably need to go back and prune the activity list.
The last word I'd love a reaction is spread love in organizations. What's your reaction to this?
So, I suppose, obviously this is the title of your organization, and it perfectly encapsulates the ambition of the organization. Part of me just feels really sad that we even have to say this and spell it out, because I love the word love. I love how kind of, because I'm sure in some jurisdictions that must feel a little bit edgy to people. but I just feel like, what would be the alternative? What, spread hate? Spread antagonism? So I just feel I almost feel sad that we even have to for this to be the invocation, because the most effective leaders are the ones who, they might not describe it as spreading love, but they're certainly spreading, respect. They're spreading their talent, they're sharing their skills, they're teaching people, as we said earlier, they're bringing on that next generation of leaders. So for me, I feel kind of sad that we even have to ask for this to be done in this explicit way. But I just think that's a pretty damning indictment about what that says about the leaders who get promoted in a lot of the organizations that we see.
Any final word of wisdoms for all the leaders listening to us around the world?
Well, I think I would say 2 things. I think the first is, excuse me, and this might not be a word of wisdom, just a kind of word of warning, is that very often in organizations, we confuse confidence with competence. In other words, the people who walk into our office and are incredibly eloquent and sell us on an idea, it's perfectly possible that they are incredibly passionate and competent and their idea is the best thing that they've ever worked on. It's also possible that they're just incredibly confident, that they came through a private school, Ivy League education, and they've acquired the trappings of confidence, And it's got absolutely nothing to do with confidence, because the really dangerous thing for organizations is these things are not necessarily related. They're not perfectly negatively correlated either, but when we conflate them and think that when we see confidence, it must mean that there is competence, that's a very dangerous assumption. So I think that's the first word of warning. The second thing I would say to all of those leaders who are out there thinking, I'm not really sure that I want power. Like, it feels a bit icky. And there might be some people there, particularly women, I think, have a bit less of a natural inclination to seek positions of power. I think I would just remind people that, unlike every other type of power, social power, the power of networks or authority, positional power is a zero-sum game. And what I mean by that is, if you and I are both going for the top job and you get it, it means that I haven't got it. So let's make sure that the organizations that we're part of give the positional power to the people who are most worthy of holding it and exercising it and using it for good. Because if all of the good people who would use positional power well, if they all take themselves out of the game and say, oh, no, I don't want positional power. No, I don't want power over other people. Then the only candidates for positional power positions will be the people who just want to be senior, rather than those who really want to lead and lead for the best. So I think that would be the final thing I'd say. Make sure that if you want to lead for the best reasons, make sure that you're working out how to get your hands on positional power, because it is a zero-sum game.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for such amazing discussion, the great tips that you gave us to be better leaders and go use all that we can do for us to change the world for the greater purpose, as you said.
That's it. Yeah.
Thank you all for listening to Spread Love in Organizations podcast. Follow us on social media and connect with us on SpreadLoveIO.com. And most importantly, spread love in your organizations and spread the word around you to inspire others and amplify this movement our world so desperately needs.